All right, everybody, before I share my screen, I just want to give you a heads up. We're going to talk about the second part of chapter 5. So we're going to talk about murder, and we're going to talk about mass murder, serial murder. We're going to talk about guns and America's uh, um, gun situation. We'll go with that wording for now. Um, and so we're going to try to run through all of that in the rest of this, and then that should get us through the violence chapter. We'll still have criminal justice to talk about the criminal justice system, but I want to make sure that we get through this. Everybody takes some breaths, and we kind of move to the next part. All right, so let me go ahead and share our screen, my screen, I guess. All right. So there's some social patterns when it comes to murder. Um, who is most likely to do it is likely someone who knows the victim. Again, most major violent crimes happen between people who know each other. Oops. Poverty increases your chance to victimization. Again, the more impoverished you are, the more areas have economic struggles, the more likely there is um, to be particular kinds of violence. Men are more often perpetrators by like a lot. And it's more intra-racial, which is meaning the same race for the perpetrator and the victim than it is intra-racial or interracial. Guns are primarily the weapon of choice. That's the what, but a variety of weapons are available to use. Here's the graphic that I think is from your book. Guns are most often used. Ignore my puppy in the background. Get back. Get back. Come on, baby. Get down. Shush. Can you get down? Pepper. But and that's mostly because it's really easy to access guns, it's easy to use them. And there's a lot of links between masculinity in this country and gun use and gun carrying. When it's more likely to happen when people socialize, so more often in the summer, more often on the weekends, more often in and around any kind of interpersonal relationships as well. The where, so you see a lot more in the southern states with higher violence rates. Those also happen to be states that have much higher guns per capita. And you see them in urban areas where people are more densely populated. The why. So there's a lot of links to social class and violence. There's a lot of links to masculinity and dominance. There's a lot of links to a prevalence of violence within our media system. So, right, we inherently perpetuate that violence as a norm because of the way in which it is perpetuated within our media, and that certain kinds of violence are not as bad. Hold on. Okay, get down this way. Sorry. And that violence, because of that, has become kind of this social norm. We get so desensitized because violence is happening so often in our media and in the messaging of our society that essentially the fact that this consistently happens becomes a regular part of our daily life, our what we expect out of our society. All right, so mass murder. Mass murder is resulting in the death of 3 or more people in one single event. So the media loves to talk about mass murder, but they don't really love to talk about the cause or the consistencies. What they like to talk about is the graphic nature, right? They love to talk about the violence themselves. There's a lot of ways in which our media perpetuates that violence by continuing to hit that let's make it as dramatic as possible button in order to kind of sensationalize or to create situations where they can get essentially more viewers, but those viewers can then be entertained, or essentially it gets closer to kind of that, as media describes it, that like over intensification of a particular emotion, right? So if you are trying to hit the fear, or you're trying to hit the um, wowed or exacerbated, or whatever you're trying to hit, then you're more likely to hit it if you do so in a very graphic and a very almost traumatizing way, right? Because you want these big reactions in order to get viewership or what have you. Because of that, things like mass murder, or things that have created a great deal of fear, um, become something that media really grabs onto, the same way it does with depictions of war and etc. Um, so place is very interesting. When we talk about mass murder, there's an increasing societal concern because this keeps happening in our school systems, because this keeps happening in everyday places like our grocery store, because kids are involved, right? So, like, the things or the people that we consider innocent in society, when those people are, when violence is enacted against them, it tends to be more of a societal concern than um, when things happen to people that are not being considered as as innocent, I guess, um, and or someone who is stigmatized by marginalization. So if you see gang violence and someone gets shot, there's much less generally, like when a gang member gets shot, there's much less likelihood that there's going to be a societal response to that in the same degree as there would be, say, Sandy Hook, where a man went in and shot several children and killed several children, right? So these things are going to have a significant impact. This graphic in particular is the sites for, remember how long the period is. I should put it underneath there. But the sites are the biggest or the most well known of the mass murders, and their size of their circle is the essential amount of individuals killed in that one incident. Um, there's also much more likelihood of a mass murder being talked about if the perpetrator is someone of a marginalized status, or someone of a status in which has already been considered threatening by the media, right? So if that particular media outlet is talking about terrorism a lot, and there's a terrorist event um, that happens and kills individuals within the country, then that particular media outlet is more likely to zone in on that particular topic, if that makes sense. All right. So real quick, we're going to get into also mass shootings are on the rise, incidents which 4 or more people are killed or injured. Here is your gun violence archive data. And this is where we were at in 2023. I believe this was at the start of February. And this is where we already are for this particular year. And also want to make note that there's also a lot of good conversation happening about why certain kinds of violences went down and certain violences did not when it comes to 2020 and our pandemic. So that is something that is very interesting to talk about. So let's talk about school shootings for a minute, because these are something that is very much on a topic of conversation within our society, and it's very much something that would be considered a modern social problem. And these are predominantly um, the mass murders that get national media attention, right? So these and major terrorist events are the ones that get talked about the most. Guns are the leading cause of death in ages 1 to 19. Gun access and how these young people are getting the guns most of the time is by getting them from family members, or that family members already had guns, and or they were sold to them in like kind of not off markets, but like maybe sold to younger audiences at, say, like a gun show type market, or more of a flea market type situation, or depending on where it is, but in places where it's not necessarily mandatory that background checks be done, etc. Um, Overwhelmingly, the perpetrators of these particular crimes are white males that are young. So we're talking 30 to 16 to 30. We'll go that route. I think that's roughly the range anyway. It might be more closer to 18 to 30. But overarchingly, they are young white males. Okay. And the problem here is that that particular feature and why that particular demographic is consistently um, doing these things is up for major debate. I have a really good article on this. If you are interested, um, please let me know. I may post it anyway, just because I think it's a really good article when it comes to talking about who the perpetrator is and why society's still having maybe a conversation as opposed to doing something about it because of this particular notion. There's a lot of failures to heed kind of warning signs or report plans. Also, there's a lot of links to this and violence against women. So you're going to see a lot of these perpetrators also had maybe a domestic violence order against them, or maybe had an arrest for sexual violence or domestic violence. You're going to see a lot of school reports of violence being done by these people, or people threatening to do violence, and not a lot of things being done about those particular kinds of threats. You're going to see a lot of this being bullied. There's a lot of violence within these people's lives in general. And you're going to see a lot of uh, vulnerable populations being targeted, right? So more often than not, there's either a vulnerable population because of age being targeted in like schools, or a vulnerable population because of a marginalized identity being targeted, whether it be in particular neighborhoods, shops, queer spaces, et cetera, et cetera. You're also going to see mental health diagnosis being blamed for a lot of these things. Mental health diagnosis do not make you inherently dangerous. Despite what the media likes to say, there are multiple people with thousands and thousands and thousands of people living with any number of mental health diagnosis that do not go and commit mass murders. So blaming it entirely on mental illness or mental health problems is not gonna cut it, right? There also has to be access to weapons. There also has to be a lack of resources. There also has to be a lack of reading of the science. There also has to be um, an understanding that we have to make accountable the people for their actions. There also has to be um, open ears to survivors of any kind of sexual or physical violence. There's supposed to be less bullying in school systems in general. There's a whole bunch of components that go into this. There's not going to be a one perfect solution. It's going to have to be a considering of multiple solutions. And we're going to get to the guns topic particularly in the last slide of this. So I'm not going to harp on those right now. And again, politics is also in play here, because anytime we are talking about guns in America, there is a very massive political upheaval centering around this idea of gun ownerships, the rights there that people have in order to own guns, the reasons for which guns are needed, the amount of guns that are needed, the ways in which things should be limited or should not be limited. There's a number of features to this political conversation, and rarely are those features productive. We'll go with that word. All right. So when you get into serial murders, the killing or more of three people in separate, usually with time in between, separate events, usually with time in between. Notice I did not put a whole bunch of serial murders on this page. I also did not put a whole bunch of horrific victims footage or what have you, because I do not want to sensationalize in any way, shape, or form murder. I want there to be a really open dialogue about the ways in which we talk about serial murder in this country because of the way in which um, we have this, yeah, I wouldn't say unique, but we have this fascination as a society right now about serial murders, about serial murder podcasts, about true crime documentaries, about all of these things that consistently show a significant amount of someone's trauma and narrative in order to kind of do the whodunits or do the sensationalization of serial murders to the point where we have, people writing and professing their love for serial murderers. And that in and of itself shows a complex dynamic surrounding these particular cases, right? So um, there's in one way, obviously, a negative society feels about murder, and on the other hand, this sensationalization or this hype that people give serial murderers, um, which gives them a significant amount of attention, a significant amount of sensationalism, fame, notoriety, um, that leaves the society lacking the compassion or the care for those who do survive these incidents, for those who have to sit on trials and tell the stories of their loved ones being lost, for those who are in any way, shape, or form touched in real life by these events in a negative way. So, just for the record, if you are a true crime buff and if you do really enjoy these kinds of things, make note about what you are thinking about the victim when you are watching these things, how they're being portrayed, um, whether or not who they're shedding a good light on, who they're giving attention to in the films or in the things that you're listening to, um, and why, where the fascination comes from, and what part of our media outlets and our society perpetuate essentially this notoriety of serial murders. What is the intent of doing that, and what is the intent of these particular um, sources of media and entertainment? All right. So serial murders are generally planned, calculated, and they have methods in which they follow. Generally, they have some kind of patterning to them. They're almost always women, or women, almost always men. Like very, very rarely are they women. Again, that falls back to the whys of that. Their motivations vary. Generally, there is a lack of empathy for humans that is manifested in some way, shape, or form. Sexual violence can be part of these crimes, but it's not always. And it's really hard to kind of track some of the numbers of victims when it comes to these particular kinds of cases due to the fact that not all the bodies are found. Not all of them are, um, depending on the group in which the victims strive from. So if they are a marginalized population, if they are specifically certain identities, like Indigenous persons, or especially Indigenous women, trans women, um, women of color, um, if they are sex workers, if they are runaways, if they are queer youth, there's a number of varying groups that tend to be targeted for their, specifically because they are not as well kept track of, and or they are part of society that has been closed off, or our society does not care for in the same ways as they care for other demographics and groups, and that has allowed that space. So a reminder to kind of take note of particularly how that happens, and if those particular serial murders or serial murder cases get talked about as much as the ones specifically geared towards white women or more well-known young people. All right, so let's talk about guns for a second. So why are Americans so invested in guns? I put some graphics on here. These are the graphics showing the support for stricter gun laws and how they have fluctuated between 2017 and 2021. There's not 2023 data out there yet for this particular study. I'm sure they will produce it. It was in April when they did it in 2021. So likely they will wait till similar months, or they are collecting that data now and will report it in similar month. But just kind of, should there be more strict than they are today? So you're seeing an overwhelming number of support for that. Should there be less than there are today? There's a very underwhelming. When you have Republican or lean Republican, there's a significant difference between those populations, right? Between the political parties. There is a reason for there is a reason for that, right? Like, and that's due to a lot of the messaging that is promoted, et cetera, et cetera. But there is still bipartisan support for some gun measures, including preventing mentally ill from buying guns, expanding background checks, and then there's wide differences on other policies, right? So if you look up here, preventing people with mental illnesses from purchasing guns, again, that's a really broad statement. So are you going to not give a gun to anyone who has depression, anyone who has anxiety, anyone who has a history of violence within theirs, anyone who, like, what mental illnesses are you talking about? There's a wide variety of that. And so it's interesting to see that number be so perpetually high without really a cause for concern about what particular mental health crises fall under that. There's also making private gun sales and sales at gun shows subject to background checks. That's still overwhelmingly supported. Creating federal government database to track gun sales, less so supported on one side, but very much supported on the other. And you're going to see this is where kind of your things start to kind of dwindle, including allowing people to carry concealed guns without a permit. Only there's again, this is essentially the opposite of up here. You're going to see a 35% of Republican leaning individuals think that guns should just kind of be there and in no way have to have a permit in any way to conceal them or what have you. So there's a lot of variety here, but I think that that's very interesting. Again, gun ownership and homicides by country. So I think that this is also an interesting data point, right? So you have your offshoot here with Israel, but for the most part, the less guns you have, the less you're going to have when it comes to this. When it comes to homicides directly geared towards guns. Let me move this down a little. And then this is the top 10 civilian gun owning countries. And this is in 2018. That number is probably just exaggerated now. You might also see some of your war-torn countries change a little bit. But other than that, that likely will be similar. So Americans seem so invested in guns, and sociology kind of gives us a few reasons. And that's perceived protections. So it's a perceived idea that those guns are going to protect you from whatever fear or threat might be arising. And that's including governmental threats. It's significantly different than it is in other countries. The way in which we idealize, fund, etc., a military industrial complex, including individual ownership of guns and the sale of guns, because there's such a venture within that particular process here in America. There's also a lot of messaging surrounding the promotion of guns. It is also seen as a freedom that's not to be lost. That's one that's inherent to us by the Constitution, et cetera, despite the fact that the majority of individuals that would own a gun now, if you don't outright own your own home and own land, you would not have, and were white and male, none of that would have mattered because you did not, you were not considered a citizen class in order to get that gun originally from the, according to the Constitution. So it is interesting to see now how that is shaped into everyone should have the right to guns and guns at whatever level they would like. It is interesting to see kind of how that dynamic has shifted and expanded in such a way. And then guns are also used consistently as a political weapon within, which is why you see such a dramatic difference down here in this. All right, so who wants legislation? So the majority of people support some form of legislation and gun reform. Again, that varies on what that particular thing is, though there's some particular types of gun legislation that have, again, overwhelming support. Even the private gun sales and making sure that there's permits and background checks for all gun sales, that still has overarching support, despite the fact that there is such a political weaponization of this particular topic. And then violence prevention. Wow, spelled that all sorts of wrong. There we go. Again, talking about how the media portrays violence and having a conversation about violence just in general throughout our society. Investment into resources for survivors of violence of any kind, and resources that are community driven as well. Education is a huge violence prevention. So making sure we're funding our schools, making sure our schools are maintaining places that are nonviolent, making sure that we're teaching nonviolence even in our schools. Cultural construction of violence. So really having a conversation surrounding how society shapes violence, what kind of violence we want to be part of our society, and what kinds of violence we want to make sure we are not keeping in our society. And it has to remain and become a social problem in some cases, especially like violence against certain kinds of hate crimes, say against the LGBTQ plus community, are still not widely accepted as a social problem. And that in and of itself is due to the marginalization status of the survivors. And that becomes a really big issue because it lacks the ability to have that brunt of social support in finding solutions, in finding resources. And without that, you're going to find far less funding for those resources. You're going to find far less gear towards finding solutions. Even things that we do have as social problems, such as rape, etc., we still have wide misconceptions about these particular topics in a way that negatively impacts survivors and lack the resources and or the social support to kind of stop some of the rape culture context that permeates that particular ideology. So then you also have having more conversations about the lasting trauma of survivorship, and that resources aren't just okay, yay, you have a place to stay to get out of that incredibly toxic relationship, because you and your kids can go stay at this women's shelter, or what have you. But really having a conversation about all of the resources in which these survivors are asking for, the ways in which community needs to be part of that process, the ways in which institutions like religion, institutions like even workplaces need to have more conversations about what kind of support they want to give survivors, whether that be making sure that there are protection measures, should somebody have an EPO that is employed with you, to make sure that they're not walking out to their car in a parking garage by themselves or something to that measure, or making sure that survivors of violence, especially if they're children, have resources within the education system, things like that. Maintaining the worth of survivors, right? So the survivorship can't be seen as something that um, takes away a human's most worth. And so often in history, a woman's worth was based on virginity or based on a particular branding message about their sexuality or their particular anatomic features. And rape can often impact those things. And if it does, and society then again relays that worth into that particular parts of these people, then you lose their ability to have worth as a person post trauma. We also need to make sure that we're leaving victims, and part of that is making sure that they are worth, um, as a society, making sure that women are worthy of being heard, that marginalized people are worthy of being heard, and making sure that when those intersections collide, we're doing a lot of listening. Um, we're going to need to make sure that the issue is humanized. And by that, I mean that we shouldn't have to have a bunch of humans come up and share stories of survivorship in order to be believed, but instead making sure that we're understanding that when we're covering this in the media, we're covering someone's trauma, that when we're sitting in a courtroom listening to or on a jury for a rape case, that we are humanizing the person that's sitting in front of you, that this survivor was a person first. They aren't their job. They aren't the clothes they were wearing. They aren't the alcohol that they decided to have that night, right? That they are a human whose body was used without their consent in a way that was demoralizing. And um, and that in and of itself should be the focus of that particular conversation, as opposed to trying to um, unsteady that worth. And then again, legislating prevention resources and legislating to make sure that there is less access to weapons that are used within any kind of these violent acts. And given how much of our violent acts in this country are perpetrated with guns, we need to really have conversations surrounding the access to guns and why that matters. All right. So let me go ahead and get out of here. I'm going to stop there and we will get back at this with chapter 6 when we come back. Again, this is a lot. Take care of yourself. Make sure that you are doing some self-care. Make sure that you are talking to somebody or asking for resources if you need them. And yeah, if you need something else, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. Okay. All right.